Hello, and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
In this episode, we're going a little further back than usual and looking at the first ever Labour government. This month marks 102 years since that government came into office, that famous and often celebrated anniversary. And so we thought we'd look back to how that came about, not least because much of the discussions that we've had recently have been about whether or not Britain is entering now a new era in its party politics, with the decline of one party and the emergence of another. And really, this is the last period in which we can say that that happened in Britain. So, Richard, to begin, I think we should reflect upon what really was, I think, some of the most chaotic years in British politics, 1922 to 1924. So this period begins with David Lloyd George, the Welsh wizard and iconic wartime Prime Minister. And in 1922, he is still Prime Minister, but he's Prime Minister as a Liberal in what is a majority Conservative Parliament. There is this ongoing post-war coalition that keeps David Lloyd George in number 10. But Conservative MPs begin to grow disgruntled with this, perfectly understandably. And in October of 1922, there is a meeting at the Carlton Club, that private members' club that's a historic home of the Conservative Party, especially in the 19th, but also into the 20th century. It's not the Carlton Club as it is today in St James's Street in London. This was a building around the corner on Pall Mall, which succumbed to a German bomb in the Second World War. But Conservative MPs gather there in October of 1922 to decide whether or not to continue the coalition with David Lloyd George. The long and short of it is that they vote against doing so. Lloyd George resigns as Prime Minister. Austen Chamberlain, the half-brother of Neville and the son of Joseph, he resigns as Conservative leader. And at that stage, we get a new Tory chief and a new Prime Minister in Andrew Bonar Law. He almost immediately calls a general election, goes to the country and wins a good, solid Conservative victory. Yet within a year, he is himself dying of cancer. He writes to the King to resign as Prime Minister and does not make a recommendation as to who should take his place. A great many wise heads think that the person to take the helm is Lord Curzon, but as it turns out, Stanley Baldwin instead is appointed Prime Minister, and he becomes Conservative leader. This begins quite a long period, really. Stanley Baldwin would still be leader of the Conservative Party in 1937, and would spend much of this time either as Prime Minister or as a very senior figure in government. Just as it seems that all might be about to be peaceful in British politics, with Baldwin taking over, he decides in autumn 1923 that he needs to take the government and the country in a different direction, in particular to try and tackle the unemployment problems that Britain is facing at the time. He decides that the thing to do is to embrace protectionism by putting up external tariffs, and he decides that he needs to go to the country, have a general election in order to do that. So, Richard, that takes us up to late 1923, when Stanley Baldwin, a Prime Minister with a comfortable majority of Conservatives in the House of Commons, decides to call an election, a snap election, in order to secure a mandate to take the country in the direction he wants it. That's going to be really the turning point in this story. But what's going on in the Labour Party at the time?
Yeah, so this is also a very momentous time in the development of the Labour Party, really some of the most crucial years in the party's history. Going back to that November 1922 election, Labour becomes the second largest party in Parliament for the first time and becomes the official opposition. And immediately after the election, the Labour leader who had led Labour into that election, John Robert Clines, is challenged by Ramsay MacDonald in a leadership election. And MacDonald defeats Clines very narrowly, thanks in part to the left of the Labour Party supporting MacDonald over Clines. a move that they would later come to regret, I dare say. It's in fact the only time in the whole history of the Labour Party where an incumbent leader has been successfully turfed out in a leadership challenge in a direct way. Who knows, maybe Keir Starmer will be the second, but we shall see. And I think no one really, in November of 1922, when Ramsay MacDonald becomes leader of the opposition, expected that 13 months later there would be another general election, because the Conservatives had a very good majority, and that the results of that general election would put Labour into power. But that's exactly what happens.
Yes, so in that election, you need 308 seats in the House of Commons to win a majority. The Conservatives win 258 seats, so they have a plurality, but their majority is gone. Labour has 191 seats, and the Liberals have 158 seats. So really, we can say that Britain, at this time at least, is operating in a three-party system. This is one of the moments, if I can interject something about Stanley Baldwin's career, this is one of the moments where Baldwin could have become the Liz Truss of the early 20th century, being a very short-lived prime minister whose own error of judgment basically imploded his leadership and his government very early on. So Baldwin, by this stage, has not been in office very long at all. The election was totally unnecessary in one sense, in terms of it was not necessary to keep the Conservatives in office. The Parliament was not about to expire, but he did it because he wanted to introduce tariffs. The remarkable thing is, though, Richard, that, and we could compare this with now, really, where I don't think this would be possible, is that he loses the election in the early December, and he's still Prime Minister at Christmas.
Yes, exactly. The election is held on the 6th of December, 1923, but Baldwin does not resign as Prime Minister until the end of January of 1924. So it's nearly 2 months after he loses his majority. The Tories were down 86 seats in that election, and Labour had gained nearly 50 seats. The Liberals had gained 43 seats. So I think today it would be seen as quite extraordinary for a prime minister who loses his majority to then think that he could stay on as prime minister for weeks at a time. But Baldwin's view was that the government should stay in place until the defeat of a major bill. And in that case, it was the King's Speech, which was presented on the 21st of January. But also, I think, in a sense, everyone knew that Baldwin would have to resign, and the suspense was whether the king would invite the leader of the opposition, Ramsay MacDonald, to form the government after that election.
It's a very difficult situation for Baldwin to be in. Undoubtedly, his own authority as Prime Minister is gone. He's called the election himself and he's lost it. But he does still have a plurality of seats in the Commons for the Conservatives. So there is an argument to say not just that he should carry on until he's defeated, but that maybe the Conservatives should try and form a minority government as the best placed party to do so. But it's unimaginable that Baldwin would be the head of that minority government, having been rebuked as he was at the polls. And so Baldwin actually resolves really quite quickly that the government should fall. But it's about managing the process for that. And it's about what will take its place. Is there a chance that the Liberals will try and formally put Labour in as the second placed party? Would Labour accept that? Historically, it's been the case that Labour did not want to work with the Liberals. And where this basically ends up getting to is that both Baldwin and Asquith take the view that the Labour Party should try and form its own minority government. And so that is then the context in which the King's Speech is defeated at the end of January, and Ramsay MacDonald, a socialist, earns the King's commission to form a government.
Well, if I can just say something before you get on to that. On the eve of the defeat of the King's Speech, there are some manoeuvres to try to use the fear of a socialist government to try to convince the Liberals to prop up the Conservative government to keep out Labour. One example of this is Winston Churchill, who had lost his seat in the 1922 election, is briefly out of Parliament at this time. He didn't come back in 1923. He hasn't made his full return to the Conservative Party at the moment. He's in a bit of a position of transition, politically speaking. But on the 18th of January 1924, he writes a letter to the Times in which he warns that if Labour is brought into government, this will be a catastrophe for Britain. He says, quote, "The enthronement in office of a socialist government will be a serious national misfortune, such as usually befallen great states on the morrow of defeat in war." And of course, the background to this is the fact that there had been this violent revolution in Russia that had seen the installment of a communist government that had led to the murder of the royal family. But also, I think, really important to understand, this is still in the relatively recent shadow of the First World War, when many of the great aristocracies of Europe came tumbling down, and there was enormous social change and upheaval that was going on. And it was largely viewed that Britain had managed to avoid the worst of that from the Conservative standpoint. And so when Churchill is making reference to the kind of catastrophe that usually befalls a country in war, he's sort of making a point that Britain had avoided the revolutionary struggles that many European monarchies had befallen during the First World War, but now we're going to voluntarily put a socialist government in. I should say that Churchill's view was not universally shared by people of a conservative or liberal disposition in Britain at the time. It's interesting looking back, Neville Chamberlain speculated that it wouldn't be such a bad thing if Labour came into government, because given the parliamentary arithmetic where Labour was very, very far from being a majority government, it would be a minority government with only 191 MPs, that he said that Labour would be, quote, too weak to do much harm, but not too weak to get discredited. And I think that his speculation was much more on the mark than Churchill's.
Absolutely. It's really the difference between the symbolism and the substance of the moment. So symbolically, of course, having a socialist appointed British Prime Minister is a monumental moment. It's part of the reason, of course, why we're talking about it, is because this is a hugely important moment in British politics. But the substance behind that symbol is, like you say, that this is a minority government without even a plurality of the votes in the House of Commons behind it. The other thing, of course, which is worth pointing out, which gets slightly missed in the words we've heard from Churchill, is that, of course, this is a socialist government brought about by democratic means. Right? It has sought election to the House of Commons. It has not basically come to power in the way that, say, the Bolsheviks did in the Soviet Union. And so the anti-socialism that is emerging within this time, and which will eventually lead to the collapse of the Liberal Party and much of the anti-socialist faction within the Liberal Party going into the Conservative Party. Of course, at the other end of the spectrum within the Liberal Party, there are people who go off into the Labour Party. People like Tony Benn's dad, for example, who had been a Liberal MP turned Labour MP. But on the anti-socialist side of it, you eventually see that coalescing within the Conservative Party. But they're doing that in response to what is a democratic phenomena and the rise of the Labour Party as a credible democratic government. It's Baldwin's resignation as Prime Minister at the end of January 24, which enables Ramsay MacDonald to become Prime Minister. But the actual event that makes him Prime Minister is an invitation to Buckingham Palace and the request from the King, who's George V at the time, to form a new government. And Richard, I wonder, what of the King in all of this? Britain at this time is a constitutional monarchy and a democracy, albeit an imperfect democracy. This is still a time when the franchise between men and women is not on an equal basis. Broadly democratic framework. And the appointment of a prime minister is not solely at the monarch's discretion. It depends upon the dynamics in the Commons and upon the advice that they receive. But unlike today, the monarch is more of an active player in political life. So what did the King make of the prospect of appointing a Labour prime minister?
Well, in that kind of transition period between the election and the fall of the Baldwin government, there are some speculations as to what would the Labour Party do about being a socialist government with a king as the head of state. Now, MacDonald had, not long before this election, I believe it was at the 1923 Labour conference, very visibly defeated a motion to commit the Labour Party to republicanism. And at that conference, MacDonald makes it clear that the Labour Party does not see the abolition of the monarchy as a desirable outcome from the perspective of the Labour Party. However, that hard work that MacDonald had done in opposition was nearly scuppered in early January of 1924 when George Lansbury, who was probably the leading voice of the Labour left, as we might call it today, gave a speech to his supporters in East London in Shoreditch Town Hall, where he makes comparisons between George V and Charles I. And he says this: "A few centuries ago, one king stood up against the common people of that day and lost his head. Oh no, really, he lost it." And there's laughter, and some people go, "Hey!" "Since that day, kings and queens have been what they ought to be if you are to have them. They've never interfered with ordinary politics. And George V would be well advised to keep his finger out of the pie now." Well, obviously, this is possibly readable as a threat to the king. Don't block a Labour government, otherwise, who knows what might happen to you? Remember what happened to Charles I. George V's private secretary noted the king's reaction when he was informed of the content of the speech. Quote, "The king referred to the recent utterances of Mr. Lansbury, in which he went out of his way to express a threat and a reminder of the fate which had befallen Charles I. His Majesty was not affected by these personal attacks." So a bit of water off the duck's back for George V. It ended up being quite useful for Ramsay MacDonald because MacDonald didn't want to put Lansbury in the cabinet, but Lansbury was such a sort of senior figure in the party that it would have been seen as sort of needlessly factional of MacDonald to keep him out. But Lansbury's intemperate remarks gave MacDonald a plausible excuse to deny him a cabinet position, which he did in that first government.
So I want us to go on to the mechanisms of governing, basically, that confront Ramsay MacDonald at the time. And, of course, it's obvious to say that he's going into this, so is the Labour Party, for the most part, without any prior experience. The reason why I caveat that slightly is there were some Labour people in the wartime administration during the First World War, but MacDonald himself was not one of them. The big challenge facing MacDonald at this point is how can he possibly govern without befalling within mere weeks the same fate that Stanley Baldwin has just suffered, i.e. you lay out your legislative agenda, you suffer defeat in the House of Commons, and at that stage your government is effectively over. There are two ways of doing that. One of them is to depend upon the generosity of your opponents, which is usually a pretty dangerous thing to do in politics, but it may be less dangerous than the alternative, which is to try and work formally with some of your opponents in order to command a majority in the Commons. So, Richard, did MacDonald and his team really give much thought to trying to work with the Liberals?
Well, I would dispute the characterization of the Liberals as a party of the left. Both then and now, I've never seen the Liberals as a left-wing party. And that view was certainly widely held within the Labour Party at that time. Clement Attlee, who was first elected as an MP in 1922, so he's a fairly new-ish Labour MP in January of 1924, just has been an MP for just 14 months, says, "A Liberal's conception of society and its ends is different from ours. Our gods are not his gods." George Lansbury, in fact, goes much further. Lansbury says that we of the British Labour movement will as ever keep ourselves clear of that unholy thing which masquerades as liberalism, And Lansbury goes so far as to say he'd rather die without ever seeing Labour in office at all, rather than see, quote, any arrangement, open or secret, with the Liberal Party. And part of that is because the Liberals were working hand in glove with the Conservatives. Why was Lloyd George Prime Minister after 1918? It was because he was propped up by the Conservatives. So even though Labour only had less than a third of the seats in Parliament, it decided that it would go in alone and form a minority government without any formal arrangement with any other party, and basically take each bill on its own. There would, of course, need to be Liberal votes to get pieces of legislation through, but there was no sense that they wanted to have some kind of formal working arrangement with the Liberals or to offer the Liberals anything from the outset.
I think that view within the Labour Party is entirely the correct one. But the flip side of that is that whatever Labour does during this time in office, it's going to be dependent upon, to some degree at least, the consent of the other parties to make it happen. Because they could be defeated at any time in the House of Commons, including on legislation, including on the most important pieces of legislation that a government has to pass. Where the Prime Minister's power and authority is much greater, even if you do have a minority government in the Commons, is in the appointment of ministers, which of course is done on the basis of the Prime Minister making recommendations to the monarch. So who does the Prime Minister choose to advise the King to put in his government? And what shape really does this first Labour administration take?
So on the 22nd of January 1924, Ramsay MacDonald is invited by George V to form a government and to become the new Prime Minister, the first Labour Prime Minister in the history of this country. George V wrote in his diary, "Today, 23 years ago, dear Grandmamma died." That's Queen Victoria. "I wonder what she would have thought of a Labour government." Probably not very favourable, I imagine. 2 days later, the new ministers go to the palace and they are given their seals of office and kiss hands with the king. There's some controversy over what they should wear. Many of these individuals were men of humble backgrounds. Some chose to wear full court dress. Others sort of a bit of a mismatch of various bits of pieces that they could borrow and find. And then some just came in their ordinary working suits. But it was an extraordinary government. This was, I think, has a good claim to be the most working class government in British history. Keir Starmer likes to make this claim. I think it's an absurd claim to make about the current Labour government. I don't think a single member of the Labour government can have a claim to have had a working class job before they entered Parliament. Every single member of this current government went to university in a country where still 2/3 of adults didn't go to university. All of them worked in middle class professional jobs before they became MPs. They worked in the law, they worked in consultancy, they worked in politics, they worked in the charity sector. It's very, very different from the backgrounds of the MPs who formed that government. So just to give you a sense of who some of these people were, the Secretary of State for War, Stephen Walsh, was a young orphan from Lancashire who was sent down the mines at the age of 13 and worked in the mines before he became an MP. Arthur Henderson, who became Home Secretary, had been an iron moulder. Jimmy Thomas, the Colonial Secretary, was the illegitimate son of a Welsh maid who was raised by his grandmother, who was a washerwoman, who started working at the age of 9 and by the age of 12 began his career working on the railways. John Robert Clines, the previous Labour leader who was appointed Leader of the House, had been a mill worker who'd started working the textile mills of Lancashire from the age of 10. Philip Snowdon, the Chancellor, had worked as a humble clerk. The Scottish Secretary, William Adamson, had been a miner. And John Wheatley, the Health Secretary, had been a mining engineer. Ramsay MacDonald himself was Britain's first truly working class prime minister. He was the illegitimate son of a Scottish farmhand who was raised by his mother, who was a maid. He was raised in poverty in Morayshire. He had a limited formal education, and he started his professional life working as a humble clerk in London. And he entered the Labour Party by actually being one of the people who helped to found it in 1900. And MacDonald remarked when Labour came into government in 1924, just 24 years after the party itself was formed, and he had been there from the beginning right up to that moment, that it was a kind of insane miracle that Labour entered office.
Far be it from me to defend Keir Starmer's pronouncements or this Labour government, but I do think it's worth probably a little bit of challenge on that. So my take on it would probably be that any comparison between then and now has to reflect a couple of things. One of them is the totally changed nature of British society, the British workforce, and the demographic profiles of the country. So, of course, lots of the jobs that you described there, which were undoubtedly working class jobs a century or so ago, are now just jobs that don't exist. Partly as a result of policy, like no longer having coal mines, and partly as a result of just changing technological and economic needs of developed nations. And so it would be impossible for today's cabinet to really compete in being working class on a comparable basis. The other point as well that's probably worth making, which I think defenders of Starmer's comment about his being the most working class cabinet so far would make, is that since this period in time, Britain has become a much, much more meritocratic society. So if you make university, for example, one of the signifiers of class status, then today, even if you're growing up in a relatively poor background in a very deprived part of the country, there are not barriers to going to university in the way that there would have been a century ago. There are still cultural barriers, there will still be additional barriers. In terms of actually getting there, there are not financial barriers really to doing that. And so they would say that actually you wouldn't expect a cabinet today, even if it was the most working class cabinet, to look in any way comparable to how it did a century ago. Where I will agree with your comment, though, is I think that MacDonald's government and administration represented a genuine social revolution at the top of the British state. It's much more remarkable that these people could put on their court clothes and go to the palace and accept the seals of office, really, than the fact that they were Labour. Keir Starmer's government is in no sense a social revolution from those that came before it.
I'm sorry, I just simply don't accept that defense of the Starmer cabinet. People, I've seen commentators sort of pretend as if working class jobs still don't exist today. About half of the British workforce are employed in jobs we might call working class jobs. Security guards, caterers, window cleaners, social care workers, delivery drivers, bricklayers, Amazon factory distribution workers, shop assistants, porters, bus drivers, plumbers. You get the picture. There's no one of that professional background in the government. Keir Starmer talks about being the son of a toolmaker. Peter Kyle talks about being the son of a security guard. Well, we're not talking in this context here about people who are working class by inheritance. We're talking about people who actually did those jobs, who were, if they had the jobs of today, who themselves would have been security guards, not the son of a security guard in the government. And so I'm not trying to deny that there are people in the Labour government who've experienced social mobility, who came up from humble backgrounds and have done very well. And I congratulate them. I think that's really important. It's something that I care very much about, is teaching at university where many of my students come from poorer backgrounds. But it's not the same as doing those kinds of jobs as an adult and having to pay the bills on a low income and worry about how you look after your family on a low income. And these individuals in the MacDonald government had direct experience as adults of that type of precarious existence, which still exists in this country today. Obviously, it looks different than it did in the 1920s, but it's an erasure, basically, of working class people in our politics today.
To bring us back to the early mid-1920s, how did this play out, this new class dynamic? for the new members of the government. Off the top of my head, I can think of some ways which are easy to overlook, perhaps, about how if you're part of the aristocracy, for example, you probably have relatives who might have court dress. You might have inherited some of it that you can simply pop on and then head down to the palace. That's not going to be the case for many of these people. Similarly, you're likely to have a country house and a London house as well if you're from a certain background. That's not going to be the case for lots of these people as well. So how did it play out in practice, this, well, I think we would both agree on, certainly a social revolution in who was making up Britain's government?
Well, in an earlier episode, we talked about grace and favour homes for politicians in Britain, and how just a few years earlier, checkers had been given to the nation, partly in recognition, as you say, Lee, to the idea that there would be prime ministers of more humble background who wouldn't have some grand country homes. So checkers became the country house for prime ministers. But there were more practical problems that were facing Ramsay MacDonald, who just simply didn't have a great deal of money. In those days, politics was not a particularly well remunerated profession, and there was less financial support for the running of government homes. So, quite practically speaking, Ramsay MacDonald didn't have the money to pay for staff to maintain 10 Downing Street in a way in which for other prime ministers they could dip into their own pockets and or bring their own household staff to work in 10 Downing Street. So there's a very touching anecdote that some of these women from Lossiemouth, Ramsay MacDonald's childhood home, where he grew up in Morrisshire and in the northeast of Scotland, came down to 10 Downing Street and volunteered to work on a rotating basis as his maids for basically for no pay, because they were so proud that this son of their village had become Britain's prime minister. There was also the issue that Ramsay MacDonald had no means of private transport. He didn't drive, he didn't have a car. These things were too expensive for him to maintain. He commuted through public transport. And so he was approached by Alexander Grant, who was the head of the biscuit firm McVitie's. And Grant provided MacDonald with a very posh Daimler car and gave him 30,000 shares in McVitie's, which were not for MacDonald to sell, but were for MacDonald to then use the dividend revenue of the shares to pay for the maintenance of the car and a driver. These days, of course, the government just pays for these things, but MacDonald didn't have that kind of money, and this was the arrangement that was made. Unfortunately, it did cause some controversy, because halfway through that year, in June of 1924, MacDonald gave Alexander Grant a baronetcy, where he therefore became Sir Alexander Grant. And this was seen as, in effect, giving away an honour in exchange for a personal benefit. And Conservatives and Liberals in the House of Commons used to regularly shout, "Biscuits, biscuits, biscuits," at MacDonald as a way of trying to remind him of this unfortunate scandal.
I want us to come on to thinking about the policy agenda of the Labour government and what it sought to achieve. When we think of the Labour Party in government in this country, we very often think of that story as starting in 1945. That's primarily because the legacy of the 1945 to 1951 Labour government under Clement Attlee as Prime Minister was not only profound, it's also still with us. There are things like the National Health Service being the most obvious and widely celebrated example. Of course, that overlooks the MacDonald government in 1924 and also later in the 1920s as well, both minority governments. I wonder to what extent that is fair. That's my first point. My second point is that I think it's really important, generally speaking, for Labour governments to have a plan when they get into office and to have a very clear agenda. Because a lot of people on the left of politics invest their hopes in a Labour government to deliver change. That's in comparison, I should say, to people who are on the right of politics historically and with Conservative governments. I think quite often, if you are a small c Conservative who votes for big C Conservative governments, you're pretty happy with stability from the government, as long as it's not taxing you in too punitive a way, so long as its impositions aren't overbearing, as long as it's broadly maintaining the fabric of society and the economy and the government, then generally speaking, I think people are happy with policies that aren't radical. That's not true of the left. That's not true of Labour governments. People look at them to deliver this really great change that they think is required. So from those 2 points, my question is this. First of all, to what extent did this government know what it wanted to do? And to what extent, given its limited capacity in the House of Commons, did it manage to do it?
Well, I said earlier that Ramsay MacDonald described the first Labour government as an insane miracle. But beyond the mere fact of its existence, I think we can say that this government performed few miracles. It was beset by very high expectations, partly because of what you've talked about, and we've talked about, Lee, about this social revolution that you see at the top of government in terms of the people who are occupying many of the ministerial roles. I should say that there were some very, very posh people in that Labour cabinet as well. So it is a bit of it's a mix. But the government has two main problems. The first is that it does not have a majority, and it's not even close to a majority. It's less than a third of the seats in the Commons. And the second is it actually doesn't have a very clear idea of what it wants to do. Now, Clement Attlee later reflected on this, sort of comparing his government to the MacDonald government, that Labour kind of won power a bit too quickly. It had gone from being a third party in British politics for 2 decades to being the official opposition in 1922 to being the government 14 months later. And the party had not psychologically adjusted to that. So there were many Labour MPs who viewed their role in Parliament as to use Parliament as a great arena to denounce the capitalist system. And Labour MPs would give long, impassioned speeches about the evils of capitalism in the House of Commons. And Ramsay MacDonald was getting frustrated with his colleagues. He wrote in his diary, "Some members do no work, but much talking, and wish to turn the floor of the House into a sort of national street corner soapbox." Right? And this is before the age of televised debates. And so actually, Labour hadn't thought very much in a kind of comprehensive way about what its programme would be. And this ended up being a huge problem for the Labour government, as I would say is a huge problem for the current Labour government, in which there hasn't been much thinking of what Labour's policy programme ought to be before Labour won power in July of 2024. But whereas I think there is a bit of a plausible excuse for the Labour governments in the 1920s, there was no excuse for the Labour government of the 2020s.
And so what about the second half of the question? They've got in with no majority and no plan. So what do they manage to actually do?
In the domestic sphere, really very little. The standout piece of legislation from this government is the Housing Act 1924, or more widely known as the Wheatley Housing Act, after the Health Secretary, John Wheatley. It's interesting because Wheatley is the only sort of out-and-out left-winger in the MacDonald cabinet, but he manages to pass a bill which provides central government subsidies to local councils to build more social housing. And this bill leads to the construction of 500,000 new council houses. And also it raises the standards of those houses. So this is the first government bill which says that new homes have to be equipped with an indoor bathroom, which is something obviously we take for granted now. But my father can remember even in the 1960s when he was a student at Leeds University, that his student housing in Leeds, which was Victorian housing run by a local landlady, didn't have an indoor toilet as late as the 1960s. So to insist that new council houses would have indoor toilets in the 1920s was a big deal. Beyond that, there's not a great deal that we can say about the domestic policies of that government. There are some more achievements on the foreign policy space, and you might say that that makes a bit more sense because foreign policy, there's more deference to the Prime Minister the cabinet and the foreign secretary to negotiate foreign policy without having to constantly come back to Parliament. So not having a majority is less troublesome in the foreign policy space. And what really remarkable about this government is that the foreign secretary is a bloke called Ramsay MacDonald. The prime minister appoints himself as the foreign secretary. And MacDonald has two major achievements in the foreign policy space, I'd say, in this government. The first is that he is involved in helping to quell what seem to be rising tensions between, on the one hand, France and Belgium, and on the other hand, Germany. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles insists on Germany making reparation payments to France, Belgium, and the United Kingdom. But by 1923, under the Weimar Republic and rampant inflation in Germany, Germany is unable to make those payments. And so MacDonald goes to the Americans and is behind the scenes quite important in the negotiation of something called the Dawes Plan, which is led by a banker called Charles Dawes, who the following year would become vice president of the United States and also would win the Nobel Peace Prize for this, where the United States would agree to loan Germany money to then pay reparations to France, Belgium, and Britain. And this was seen as really important in achieving peace in Europe because France and Belgium had actually mobilized their forces into the Ruhr to basically say to Germany, if you're not going to pay us reparations, then we're going to take some of your territory back for us, which of course could have led to war. So that was an important achievement. Obviously, it didn't work out in the long run, but there was some logic behind it, which was that if the Americans finance German reparations, then Germany becomes dependent on American credit, and therefore the United States gets to have more influence over the direction of travel of Germany's politics. And it all kind of falls apart because of the Great Crash in 1929. But if that had not happened, then maybe Germany would have gone in a different direction. And the second great achievement, as the government would see it in the foreign policy space, was that the Labour government recognized the Soviet Union as the legitimate government of the USSR and negotiated a treaty, which was basically a trade deal with the USSR.
We're going to come back to that point about the Soviet Union in a moment. But I just wonder, from what you've said, there's not much on the economy. And of course, it's a socialist government. One of the things that you might have expected to see from it would be a move in the direction of economic planning. Is there really any effort to try and rethink how the British state and the British economy interact?
No, not really. This was a government that, broadly speaking, followed kind of economic orthodoxy. There were some attempts to say that the budget that Philip Snowden, the Chancellor, put forward was a housewife's budget that brought down the prices of certain household goods by cutting various consumption tax. But this was not a massive redistributive budget. This was not a government that sought to reorganize ownership in the British economy. Part of that is because they were, again, a minority government. But part of it also was that Ramsay MacDonald and Philip Snowden both basically saw socialism as an ethical question. They regarded capitalism as evil. They wanted to see a socialist society brought about, but they thought that socialism was really more a matter of people's hearts and morality, and it was about how people related to each other in society. That you have a society where everyone regards everyone else as their equal, not so much about a question about the formal management of the economy. Or that really they believe that first you have to get people to believe in socialism as a moral question, and then society's organization would change. Not that you change the economic order through government legislation first, and then everyone regards themselves as equals. So it's quite interesting because I think today people just see MacDonald and Snowden as these right-wing figures, but actually they were very, very deeply committed socialists. They just believed that the way that you brought about socialism was through almost like philosophical conversion, as you would to a religion, rather than through government legislation.
As we'll come on to in a moment, this is only a 9-month government, give or take. But even within that time, there's plenty of opportunity for what Donald Rumsfeld once called the known unknowns, of even the unknown unknowns, to emerge and knock a government off course. What Harold Macmillan once described as events, dear boy, events, as the things that can really make governing the nation very difficult. So you've spoken, Richard, about the legislative agenda of the government. But what events did it face that it couldn't necessarily predict, and how did it respond to them? Do any particularly stand out to you?
Well, in the first week of the new Labour government, the train drivers in the ASLEF union went on strike. At this time, the rail network was privately owned, so it wasn't a strike against the government. But the big four rail companies basically wanted to reduce the wages of railway workers and to increase their hours, and the workers went on strike. If they expected the new Labour government to at least vocalise support for the striking railway workers, they were quickly disappointed by that, because the MacDonald government sided with the railway firms and basically said that the railway workers should get back to work. This led to the leader of ASLEF, John Brumley, say, quote, "If the success of the Labour Party and of a Labour government can only be built on such serious losses in wages and conditions, I am not sure that the workers will very much welcome a Labour government." The industrial situation worsened over the next few months. In March of 1924, London Underground workers, dockers, and tram drivers decided to go on strike. And here, MacDonald was determined to stop them directly. So the circumstance of this is that MacDonald wanted to invoke the Emergency Powers Act, which had been passed under that Lloyd George Liberal Conservative coalition in 1920, despised and reviled by the Labour Party at the time. But now MacDonald wants to use the Emergency Powers Act to deploy the military to basically force the striking workers to get back to work. He sends 2 of his privy councillors up to see the King. The King's up in Liverpool. He's at Knowsley Hall, which is the home of the Earl of Derby. It's the Grand National. And to basically say to the King, can you invoke the Emergency Powers Act? The King agrees. He's rather impatient because they're delaying him getting to the Grand National. It ends up being the King's lucky day. He puts his bet on the winning horse, so he ended up quite happy from that. But it was a much less happy situation for the Labour movement. Now, in the end, MacDonald did not need to use the military against the workers. They went back to work. But the mere threat that he was going to use it, the mere show that he was prepared to invoke this legislation, put a very, very sour taste in the mouths of British trade unionists. Ernest Bevan, who was leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, who'd eventually become a minister in the Attlee government and would be Minister for Labour under the wartime Churchill government, years later condemned MacDonald for rushing down to Windsor to ask the King for these emergency powers. It's a bit of poetic license. It wasn't Windsor, it was Knowsley Hall, but I think the effect is the same. So this begins a rupture between MacDonald and the trade unions, which would only get worse as time went on.
Let's come to the end of this government. And to do that, we really need to think a little bit about foreign policy and what becomes the trigger for its downfall. So, of course, this is the 1920s. In the previous decade, the Bolsheviks had taken over Russia. They didn't just do that. In the process, they murdered the king's cousin and his family in order to set up a socialist republic. This wasn't originally recognized by the British. In fact, when there was a civil war in Russia, the British fought on the white side as opposed to the red side in order to try and oppose the Bolshevik takeover. You've already said that MacDonald changes that and recognizes the legitimacy of the Soviet authorities as the legitimate government of Russia. How does he go about doing so, and how is that judgment and that decision received?
Well, it's highly controversial. MacDonald writes that when he saw the king on the 22nd of January 1924, where the king invites him to form a government, the king makes some kind of quip that he hopes that I will do nothing to compel him to shake hands with the murderers of his cousin, which is obviously a reference to the idea that when we recognize a country, they send ambassadors and their credentials are reviewed and accepted by the king. So he didn't like the idea that someone who had shot Tsar Nicholas II might be then appointed ambassador to the United Kingdom from the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, that didn't stop MacDonald from recognizing the Soviet Union. MacDonald saw the good relation with the Soviet Union in economic terms. The Soviet Union by that point still had not industrialized. It was very, very backward, industrially speaking. It hadn't had the benefit of Stalin's 5-year plans and the rapid industrialization that the Soviet Union would see in the 1930s and 40s. So they were in desperate need of machinery. They were in desperate need of certain manufactures and supplies, which Britain, at that time, we were still a country that made a lot of things. We were a very industrialized country, was producing as a surplus. And so MacDonald wanted to sell some of our surplus as exports to the Soviet Union. But the other problem that the Soviet Union had is that the Soviet Union didn't have any money. So even though they did need these things, they actually couldn't pay for them. So MacDonald agreed a loan with the Soviet Union, where we would loan the Soviet Union money to then buy our goods for the Soviet Union. This was very strongly criticized by the right-wing press as money for murderers. But actually, it made a lot of sense. It was, if it's a loan, you're going to get paid back for it anyway with interest. So it's actually not a bad deal. And secondly, you create an economic dependence of the Soviet Union on British supplies. And at a time when other major countries hadn't sort of gotten into the market, so to speak, with the Soviet Union, Britain was going to establish an early first mover competitive advantage. So there was good logic to it, but there was a lot of controversy around it.
And it's within that context, the controversial recognition of the Soviet Union, that a really rather curious saga leads to the downfall of this government.
Yeah, the event that causes the downfall of the Labour government is so obscure, it almost seems ridiculous to have to go through it, but it is worth telling because it is what caused the downfall of the government. This affair surrounds a man called J.R. Campbell, who's the acting editor of the Workers' Weekly communist newspaper in Glasgow. And in July of 1924, he publishes an open letter in that newspaper to British soldiers calling on them not to shoot members of the working class. He writes, "Have you forgotten how the Labour government threatened to use the naval men during the dockers' strike this year? How in the tramway strike, the government threatened to introduce the Emergency Powers Act, which would have forced you to have shot your own brothers and fathers? Let it be known that neither in the class war nor in the military will you turn your guns on your fellow workers." Well, the Director of Public Prosecutions was shown this article, and he referred it to the Attorney General, who was a man called Sir Patrick Hastings, suggesting that the government might like to bring prosecution against Campbell under a rather obscure 18th century law called the Sedition to Mutiny Act, 1787. Now, Hastings agreed, and Hastings instructed the DPP to begin prosecution against Campbell. This was ill-advised for various reasons. Most Labour MPs probably agreed with Campbell. James Maxton, who admittedly was one of the more left-wing members of the government, said in the House of Commons that the article, quote, contains mainly a call to troops not to allow themselves to be used in industrial disputes, and that point of view is shared by a large number of members sitting on these benches. Certainly the trade unions agreed with Campbell. The legislation that was going to be used to prosecute him was ancient and obscure. The newspaper was a tiny, largely irrelevant fringe left-wing newspaper. The call to mutiny was not actually very clearly articulated. And Campbell, it turned out, was a distinguished war hero himself who had fought in the First World War and had had to have part of his feet amputated during that war and was a recipient of a government disability pension because of his distinguished wartime service. Now, Patrick Hastings, not to draw too many comparisons, but Patrick Hastings was more of a lawyer than a politician. He didn't see the political costs of bringing this prosecution about. He just thought, well, there's a case that can be answered here. It's one that we can make as a government, and we can prosecute him. But really, he should have thought about the wider political costs of this. So when the cabinet was informed about this, they basically reacted against it and said, we cannot prosecute this man. This is going to be a complete disaster for the government. From our own side, our own people are going to revolt against us for doing this. Again, not to make too many comparisons with the current Labour government, but you can see them. So they do a U-turn and they say that we are no longer going to prosecute J.R. Campbell. Well, then the Tories and the Liberals pounce on this. And they whip up this idea that the reason why Ramsay MacDonald doesn't want to prosecute Campbell is because MacDonald himself might be called as a witness for the defense in this case, because MacDonald himself, during the First World War, had defended people against such types of legislation on the grounds that it should be legitimate to be a conscientious objector and to oppose the First World War. When he's asked about this in the House of Commons, MacDonald denies this. He claims that he didn't have any knowledge about this prosecution, not to do with me, it was to do with my Attorney General. Don't blame me. And this was seen as very, very unsatisfactory. So the Conservatives bring about a motion of censure against the government. The Liberals then bring about an amendment to that motion to say that there should be at least an inquiry into what happened in the Campbell affair. There's a vote on the Liberals' amendment, and the Tories and the Liberals vote on that amendment, and the government is overwhelmingly defeated. And after that, MacDonald meets with his cabinet. It's nearly midnight after the vote, and they agree that the next morning he should go to the King and request a dissolution of Parliament and a new election.
I think you're right to say that in some ways it feels like quite a small thing for a government to fall over. But if I offer my quick take on it first, then let me know where you agree or disagree. Governments quite often fall over fairly trivial or small matters, but they are the straw that breaks the camel's back, to use the old metaphor. If you think most recently about the resignation of Boris Johnson and the Chris Pincher affair, in and of itself, that is not why Boris Johnson resigned. It was just the moment at which his resignation became unavoidable. And I feel like in this case, MacDonald is dealing with all the accumulated pressures of being Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary in a minority government at this time, when it is certain that at some stage there is going to be an issue of sufficient magnitude on which the government will lose a vote in the House of Commons and a general election will have to happen. This is not going to be a 5-year parliament. Around this same time, the Conservatives are becoming increasingly optimistic, almost confident, that whenever an election does come, they will win it. And so they will certainly rally their troops to bring about an election at some stage soon. As a slight side note to that, by this stage, Baldwin has given up the commitment to tariffs, which was seen as partly what cost him the election in 1923. You've given it up at least until it's obvious that there's been a change of heart on the part of the public. And so at some point, this government was going to collapse. And this is the moment that affords its opponents the opportunity at the right time to embarrass the government and bring that about. quite why MacDonald thought this was the issue to go over, rather than simply try and tough it out and force him to bring a formal confidence vote about, is a slightly different matter.
Yeah, I mean, it is on the face of it a curious thing to reside over. It wasn't like it was the first defeat of our government. The government was regularly defeated in the House of Commons, as you might expect a government that only has a third of MPs. There are a few different theories as to why this happened. One is that actually the Conservatives, I'd kind of say semi-conspiracy, that MacDonald was going to be a defence witness in Campbell's trial, and that the inquiry that the Liberals put together would have revealed this. Some people say maybe that there was some truth in that. The second explanation is that some people say, well, MacDonald knew that he was going to face big defeats on the Soviet treaties. It was a series of treaties that he was agreeing, and wouldn't have been able to get the finance to support the loan to the Soviet Union. And so rather than the government falling on that issue, which then would have basically made the election an election about should we give money to the Soviet Union or not, let's make the election about something rather trivial, about Campbell, so that people vote on other issues and we suppress the salience of the Soviet Union issue. And the third explanation is that MacDonald was worn out, that by having made himself Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, he had taken on far too much, that he was very, very overworked, he was very overtired, and he just couldn't hack it, basically. And so he willingly brought the government to an early end.
As you've said, Richard, what MacDonald does at this stage is request a dissolution. And so we have a general election in 1924, the third general election in 3 years. And for Stanley Baldwin and the Conservatives, it is a moment of absolute triumph. So the Conservatives gain 154 seats in this election to have 412 in the House of Commons. Interestingly, it's not a disastrous election for the Labour Party. They lose 40 seats to be down to 151. But the people for whom this election is really a nightmare are the Liberals. So the Liberals lose 118 seats to be down to just 40. And I see the 1924 election really as being the moment when their status as the third party in British politics, which is what they would remain basically for the rest of the 20th century and into this century, is confirmed. What that election is most well remembered for is the Zinoviev letter, which has really become one of the very well-known, but I'm not always entirely sure why it's quite so well-known, phenomena in early 20th century British politics. So this is a letter that is published in the Daily Mail 4 days before the general election. It feeds into that narrative that big parts of the left have about the Daily Mail being one of the great bogeymen in British political and media life. And it's said to be from the president of the Comintern, the Communist International, to Arthur McManus, a British communist. And it's encouraging him to prepare for insurrection or revolution in Britain if the Labour Party wins the 1924 election. This obviously is like putting a lighter to some petrol-soaked kindling in the context of this election, not least with all of this discussion that's been going on in government and in the campaign about how a Labour government relates to the Soviet Union. But Richard, my understanding is that certainly a lot of people in Labour thought that the publication of the text of this letter was a disaster for them.
Yeah, when the Labour MPs heard about this, they thought it was the nail in the coffin for the campaign. I mean, I don't think the Labour MPs thought that Labour would win this election. And then when this came out, Jimmy Thomas, who was the colonial secretary, said, we're sunk. And it certainly has become one of those great kind of parts of Labour law. I mean, the Zinoviev letter is something that, I don't know if children learn about it at school, but I can certainly remember, I learned about my Labour history from my grandmother, and it's one of those things that she would make reference to, that in effect the Conservatives stole the 1924 election, which she lived through herself, because of the Zinoviev letter. Labour at the time very much thought that the letter was a fake. In 1928, the Baldwin government did an investigation and declared that it was real. And then in 1999, the Blair government did another investigation and concluded that the Baldwin government was wrong. It was a fake, and that the Labour view that had always been the Labour view since 1924 was the correct view. And that, I think, is seen as the definitive take on the Zadolfi flight, that it was indeed a fake. And we've never, ever seen the original.
Never let it be said that the Labour Party can't bear a grudge and still want to relitigate the battles of old, many, many decades on. Richard, to conclude this episode then, what would you say is the legacy of this first ever Labour government?
John Robert Clines, who had been Labour leader before MacDonald and then served as MacDonald's leader of the House of Commons, later reflected on the end of the first Labour government by saying that Labour was turfed out in 1924, quote, not because we were doing badly, but because our rivals felt we were doing too well. Well, I had to say, I don't think that was actually a very widely held view, even among the Labour Party. Philip Snowden took the view that Ramsay MacDonald had, quote, thrown away the greatest opportunity which ever came to a party. I think the circumstances of governing when you have fewer than 200 MPs is always going to be very, very challenging. And I think that the legacy of that Labour government, therefore, is not really in its policy achievements beyond the Wheatley Housing Act. But what I think is very important from its legacy are two things. The first is that this is a socialist government that shows that socialism and socialists can work within the British constitutional order, and that there is not a fundamental conflict between wanting to bring about a socialist society and maintaining the core institutions of the British state, the honours system, the monarchy, the House of Commons and House of Lords, etc. And there was a question mark over that until Labour came into office, and that first Labour government settled that. And that became, of course, very, very important by the time of the Second World War, because the legacy of the MacDonald governments was such that there wasn't a view that when Churchill formed that wartime coalition with Attlee in 1940, that Labour could not be trusted as being a cuckoo in the nest, as some kind of unpatriotic party. So that's really important. The second, I think, important legacy from this government is that, as you say, Lee, the 1924 election really kills off the Liberals' prospects of becoming the second or first party in British politics again. And part of that is because MacDonald had decided not to hug the Liberals, but to keep them at a distance. And there were lots of Liberals who were grumpy about this. Lloyd George claimed that the MacDonald government could have survived for 3 years if he had done more to bring the Liberals into the government in a more formal manner, whether that was a coalition or some kind of deeper supply and confidence arrangement. Lloyd George wrote of the downfall of that government, I have done my best to precipitate it. They could have remained in another 3 years and formed a working alliance with liberalism that would have ensured a progressive administration of this country for 20 years. There's that myth of this kind of progressive alliance, which we still hear in politics today. But by saying no, liberalism and socialism are different ideologies, that they are not interchangeable parties. At a time when the working class are being given the full franchise in this decade and are coming into British public life in a major way, it showed that if you are someone who believes in either socialism or the advancement of the working class, that you don't have two choices in British politics. You have one, and it's the Labour Party. And that was a very, very important move. And it's interesting, Stanley Baldwin reflects on this as well. He wrote, for some time I felt that things were shaping themselves towards the disappearance of the Liberal Party. Now he felt that what Labour needed to do was to crush the communists and to distance itself from communism. But if it could do that, Baldwin wrote, then we shall have two parties, the party of the right the Conservative Party, and the party of the left, the Labour Party, and Baldwin's prediction ultimately proved true, at least for a century.
And if I finish on just a nice note for Baldwin, really, we began this episode by talking about his blunder of calling the 1923 general election. But what in the short term looks like blunder, in the slightly longer term, by luck or by judgment, ends up delivering exactly what he wanted. Two major parties, of which the Conservatives are the undoubted anti-socialist vehicle in Britain. And like you say, Richard, in that sense and others, these events had a very long tail in our political life. We finish as ever with a discussion of the books that we're reading at the moment. I'll kick us off. I'm currently reading Waiting for the Wave by Tom Flanagan. Now, this is a book about Canadian politics, and in particular, the Reform Party, as was in Canada. And it looks at, in the first part, one man in particular, a man called Preston Manning, who was the key founder of Reform. If you want to draw analogies, of course, you draw them with Nigel Farage. And it goes into detail about his strategy, his thinking, his approach to populism, the way in which he would pitch his message with constructive ambiguity, and how he then managed to take the Reform Party from being a relatively small fringe regional party into a major party of the Canadian right that beat the Progressive Conservatives, as was at the time in the 1993 Canadian election. An election that the Liberal Party won, though neither party of the right entered government in that election. And that would eventually merge with a former Reform man, Stephen Harper, as the head of the Conservative Party of Canada and Canadian Prime Minister. Now, this is a story that, of course, has become much more interesting and relevant to followers of British politics in recent years, as Nigel Farage has not only stolen the name Reform, but is also trying to steal, to some degree at least, the playbook of Reform in Canada. It's something we've spoken about on this podcast a great deal, and at times we've drawn upon the Canadian example. So I wanted to read a little bit more about it, not because I expect the British Reform to play out in the same way as the Canadian version did. If history doesn't repeat but often rhymes, well, sometimes the rhymes get even weaker when you translate from one political system to another. But at the very least, it's an incredibly interesting way to see how a challenger party of the right can try and establish itself in a first-past-the-post, Westminster-style democracy within a Commonwealth realm. So certainly I don't expect, and haven't found so far, that the lessons of this book will be naught. Richard, what are you reading at the moment?
Well, I want to suggest to our listeners, if they enjoyed this week's topic, to have a look at the book by John Shepherd and Keith Laybourn, entitled Britain's First Labour Government. Shepherd and Laybourn are two of the most distinguished historians of the Labour Party of the last half century. John Shepherd sadly died not that long ago, but John wrote, I think, one of the great Labour biographies, which was his biography of George Lansbury, who we've talked about in this episode. I would say of this book, it's not the best book of Labour history, and it sometimes reads very much like it was a book written by two people who didn't always read what the other person was writing, and so it feels like it repeats itself at various points, and I think it may have benefited from a bit more editing. But these are two people who know what they're talking about, have written this book based on decades of accumulated research about interwar Labour history, and it is ultimately also still done in still written in quite an accessible manner. So have a look at that. Britain's First Labour Government by John Shepherd and Keith Laybourn.
We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all for this episode. Just to let you know what's coming up on Since Attlee and Churchill, on Tuesday there'll be a special bonus episode for members of our Patreon, in which Richard and I debate who really won the contest between Heath versus Wilson. And on Thursday, we'll be back with the next instalment of Matters of Interest. If you'd like to find out more about the Patreon, there's a link in the show notes. And if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, we would, as ever, be very grateful if you left us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts from.
Thanks very much.